Hello from day 4 of a landscape photography and backpacking tour here in the Drakensberg in South Africa. Today we've got about 8 kilometers to walk before we get to camp, but I'm really excited to get there because this is a completely new location to me. There's actually 2 different areas that I want to photograph, so I'm just hoping that today, unlike yesterday, the cloud and mist is going to stay away so that this afternoon we can explore the views a bit more and figure out what we're actually going to do at sunset and at sunrise. But first we've got to get hiking. Hello from a pretty idyllic campsite at the top of Gray's Pass. We've actually had a pretty lazy afternoon so far. We got here early, we've had a bit of a swim and a wash, we've done some laundry, we've had our lunch outside and just generally enjoyed being in this lovely place. The photography has to take a back seat every now and again so you can have a proper relax, but we are going to go and have a bit of an explore now. There's potentially 2 great viewpoints here actually. One up to my right, Vulture's Retreat, and one up to my left which should look across at Monk's Cowl and Cathkin Peak and some of these famous mountains here in the Drakensberg. So I'm a little bit unsure what I'm going to do, but I'm going to go for a wander and see what I can see. Our riverside camp was incredibly close to the top of Gray's Pass, which is one of the passes that would take you all the way down to the bottom of the valleys. But of course, in this case, we were just up here to admire the view. And we certainly had excellent views with the cloud wrapping round the mountains, and we could see all of the mountains that made up this ridge escaping the escarpment. So that's the Sturkhorn, Cathkin Peak, Monk's Cowl and Champagne Castle. And I maybe should have spent more time focusing on photography, but instead I was just enjoying the views and walking some of the edges, and I thought I'd show you this clip because it shows you just what an incredible drop there was beneath us. I think this is about 1,000 meters looking down into the valley there, but great views across to that ridge. But unfortunately I didn't put too much effort into my photography at that point. We were very close to camp and I thought we had a lot of time and the light would only improve, but unfortunately the cloud thickened, so we gradually lost that ridge, and it was only as I realized it was going to disappear that I thought, hang on, I better take a photo here. So this is the best that I managed, but then I did completely change my approach. I had a little wander around and looked for a different location to photograph. So this is the rough area that I'm working with, and you can see there are some lovely skeletal dead bushes here, as well as some much fresher greener bushes and some nice orange grasses too. So a nice mixture of flora, both dead and alive, and a nice foreground that, you know, I don't come across too often in the Drakensberg, to be perfectly honest. There's lots of nice grasses, but not so much these bushes. And with that buttress in the background, with the cloud forming off the edge of it like that, it's simply a matter of alignment and just tweaking the composition. So I think bringing the camera lower like this, just to bring those bushes into the bottom of the frame, yeah, I think that really does balance pretty well. and it'll be my usual trick of shooting a 4x5 portrait frame. I might try the landscape as well. It looks like it could kind of work. Yeah, pretty happy with that one. I keep hunting for these scenes in the Drakensberg to introduce variety into my portfolio, but whilst you do see these bushes on the edge, it's much harder to find this sort of mini garden. And these dead bushes are the real star of the show, but it's nice that those green shrubs have taken on this rounded shape, and there's a nice colour palette there too, in part thanks to those orange grasses on the right. And it's all helped by some pretty sympathetic flat lighting, and I love that gap in the cloud on the left that lets you see through to the hills, as well as the plume of cloud on the right. But aside from anything else, it was just brilliant fun photographing this scene. The main joy for me of the photography itself is in the problem solving of composition. And of course, there's a lot of decisions to make here. How do I position everything? What do I cut through? How do I frame the background? And so on. It's just a lot of fun. I also shot this scene in landscape format, which I think works equally well. Certainly the cloud at the back there benefits from the extra space, and there's also more of those orange grasses. So I guess one point to make here is that it's often worth trying to shoot different formats, if nothing else because it gives you choices. The light started to get exciting towards the cathedral ridge, so the rest of the group headed there, but I decided to have a bit of an explore along the river to see if there were more foregrounds to be had. I finally found something complex to shoot. I figured I'd just see what this river valley looked like, because the light was coming through on the ridge that you see in the distance there. I came down, I saw these amazing bushes. I think these have flowers on in the summer, but even as they are here at the end of summer, they are quite lovely. And you can see there's a really nice alignment here between the river and well, here's my tripod creeping into the bottom of the frame there, so this is where I took my image. You can see nice alignment between the river and the bushes and the mountains there, and this perfect symmetrical framing on either side. It's a scene that fits together just beautifully, and really very different from the work I've produced in the Drakensberg before, so very, very pleased with this shot. I'm going to waffle on for a bit here because I really like this image and there's a lot to say. So starting with the technical side, this was actually produced from a total of 9 exposures. I had to shoot an exposure bracket because of the tonal range, but I also needed to focus bracket to achieve sharpness front to back. So I shot 3 sets of exposure brackets, starting with the darkest image, which is exposed to retain highlight detail in the sky. And then I take 2 brighter exposures at 1.5 stop intervals. And those 3 exposures are then combined into an HDR DNG and edited in Lightroom. I then repeat that process for the 2 differently focused exposure sets, and I copy across the edits from that first HDR DNG to the other 2. So I have 3 differently focused HDR DNGs, 1 focused for the foreground, 1 for the midground, and 1 for the background, which I can then combine manually with layer masks in Photoshop before applying my final edits. So that's the technical side, but I also wanted to talk about the image content in general. I showed this image to a couple of the guys on the trip and they were pretty lukewarm about it. I'd put that down to a couple of things. Firstly, lighting. We have fantastic lighting in the background, but the foreground is a little flat. But for me, that focuses the viewer on the distant ridge while still allowing the foreground to work as the general setting of the image. And secondly, some people will find this overly complex or even messy. I don't want to go into that too much because I could talk for an hour on that subject, but I think that most of the imagery we're exposed to at the moment is fairly minimalist, and that's bound to negatively impact our view of scenes that are more complex like this.
The complexity is really what I find appealing, and the various defects that I know are there are also part of the charm of the image for me personally. But what I will say is compositionally, I really worked at this. In fact, I shot the scene a total of 10 times as the light changed and I tweaked the framing, which meant I actually shot 90 images to get this final result. I then joined the others on the edge and started to record some video, but the light faded pretty quickly before I had the chance to take any photos. We hung around for a while longer just to see if anything changed before eventually heading back to camp for dinner with Z and an early bed ready for sunrise.
So another change of plan, because there is a lot of cloud about this morning, and that's going to stop any early glow from lighting the Cathedral Ridge and allowing me to photograph both locations. So I am just going to photograph this Cathkin Ridge view here. One thing that's really surprised us is the lights down in the valley, actually. We couldn't see those even when it was clear yesterday, and I guess that's because the buildings are very sympathetic to the landscape. They're built of mud bricks and so on. But anyway, the sunrise should be coming up over that peak in the middle there, that lower peak. So compositionally it should work fine, but of course we've got all this cloud blocking the sunrise. So we'll just have to cross our fingers and see what happens. It really is incredibly dark still, but you can see this hill here is actually starting to catch just a little bit of light from that horizon. So I think it's going to be worth me trying to just take a still of that, leaving out the city lights and the mist in the distance there, and just get the ball rolling on the photography, because it's a very clear morning, at least to these near hills, and I think that hill's actually going to make a nice simple shot.
This shot actually worked less well than I thought it would. I think sometimes the almost purple colour of the light in that pre-dawn can have weird effects on the green, so this needs different conditions to work, which you're about to see.
So here's that wide view of the ridge, and we can now see the colour where the sun is going to come up. And I think that colour is going to stay very localised, so I'm actually going to switch to a telephoto lens and actually just photograph that jagged ridge, the Sturkhorn, that lower left peak. And I think that'll work as just a nice, simple, colourful frame, probably a silhouette, and then the blue hills and then some colourful sky above. Simple, but I think it'll work well. Here comes the sun. I better shoot this very quick because the colour is changing rapidly.
It would have been a shame to come all this way and not photograph this scene of the Sturkhorn, and it's definitely beautiful, but unfortunately I've been spoilt far too much in the Drakensberg to get excited by a shot like this. The problem really was that haze and cloud on the horizon just not allowing any sunlight through, so really this was the only area of the sky that had colour, and so it was really the only option as far as I was concerned.
Blink and you miss it, because there goes the sun into the cloud, and it actually doesn't look like it's going to re-emerge for a while yet. But of course we're going to keep waiting, because it's so clear up here that any light at all in this early first hour is going to produce some lovely scenes. Well, the sun has made its way through a gap. That's too contrasty really to make a nice image of. It's a really pretty wild contrast. But more importantly, the light is now coming down on the hill beneath, which is really looking pretty epic. And I might try polarizing this, although it's quite close to the angle of the sun, so it'll be interesting to see what that does.
The polarizer certainly did make a big difference, although I wasted precious moments getting it on the lens. This mountain is called Cathkin and actually has a hole in it from certain perspectives, so it's a cool peak to shoot. And I think this was shot around the peak of the light on the mountain, but I realised this was perhaps too simple to just show it on its own, so I switched to wider perspectives. I think this portrait version is much more interesting, and introducing the background really adds depth and helps to make the image more dimensional, but also in a more simple way, just showing the mountain within a wider context gives it a bit of scale in that sense. And the edit here was actually quite tricky. For some reason, greens like this can really cause me problems, and maybe I'll get into that in a different video. But I also tried the landscape version, but by that point the light had passed on the hill, so whilst it still works, it doesn't have the drama of that portrait image. And that's it, the light has passed now, and that really is why we wait a little bit after sunrise, because that gap always did have that chance of just producing a moment of light, and it really was a moment, maybe a minute at most. So had to work very, very fast there. That bit of sunlight has found its way onto different parts of the landscape now, and this is looking into the distance towards some of those Zulu settlements that we saw lit up at dawn, but those hills are just exquisitely lit. It really is beautiful. I wasn't anticipating this light at all, to be honest, and I certainly wouldn't have thought it would be quite so transformative on the distant landscape. The first couple of images show the landscape around Bergville pretty nicely, but it's these next images that I really want to show you. The first has this amazing pool of light making a nice curve on the left there, but what transforms the scene for me is that hot air balloon, which really delivers a sense of scale. But it's this second image that I will actually put in my portfolio. There's an absolutely stunning transition of pastel colours with plenty of subtle details to hold your attention. But once again, there's another hot air balloon, and this time at the bottom right to bring some scale and a nice little detail. And it's funny really, because in both images the balloon is pretty important, but I didn't see either of them until I actually reviewed my images, so there you go. So hopefully you enjoyed that video. Not quite the morning that I expected, but we had some amazing light on the lower landscape as the sun broke through the clouds there. Please do like and subscribe if you'd like to see more. I'll probably have a couple more videos coming from the Drakensberg.